the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland. Years full of suffering and death and sacrifice. Now the war against Germany is won.
It has been 20 years since the Second World War ended with the failure of the Allied invasion at Normandy. A triumphant Hitler declared victory over Europe and the British Empire. The United States withdrew from the conflict, listening to those like Charles Lindbergh, who had argued against a war with Germany. In the East, only the Russians fought on in a bitter guerrilla war. American efforts turned to retribution for Pearl Harbor. That came in the summer of 1945 with victory over Japan. By then, American General Eisenhower had returned from Europe to the United States and a humiliating retirement. In 1947, King Edward and Queen Wallis assumed the British throne. Winston Churchill, who had barely escaped with his life after Normandy, died in exile in Canada in May 1953.
But what if that had actually happened? What if the Axis did indeed win World War II? So what if Hitler and his Nazis did win World War II? That is possibly the greatest what if of our time. The map I'm about to show you just shows how close they came. This has led novelists and historians to speculate what would have happened if Hitler and his Nazis did indeed win. I'm about to show you some fictional scenarios where the Nazis do indeed win and what it means to the rest of the world, followed by some speculation to whether they could have actually done it. Ultimately, it was Hitler's dual blunders that led to his downfall. Invading the Soviet Union and declaring war on the United States were big mistakes. It was the citizens of the Soviet Union that paid most dearly for Hitler's ambitions and that paid most dearly for the Allies' victory. If it wasn't for their dogged determination and sacrifice, Hitler well may have been victorious. So what was it about the Germans winning World War II that fascinates us so much today? I think there are two reasons for this. World War II was the largest and most costly war in all of human history. It was the last war to see large-scale fighting in Europe, and it ended over 70 years ago. And it is instilled in living memory of not insignificant members of the public today. Secondly, World War II is perhaps the only war in history where there have been an obvious good guys and an obvious bad guys. Wars, in their very nature, seem to be morally ambiguous, but the Holocaust cannot be seen in the same light. While the Allies did commit war crimes, that can no way compare to the Nazis trying to exterminate a whole race of people. If Nazi Germany won the war, there would have been no question to what would have happened to any Jews or unfavoritables who had the misfortune of finding themselves on the border of the Greater German Reich. So, what would have the world looked like if Nazi Germany had won? Well, there is no telling for certain, but that still hasn't stopped writers and historians from speculating. Here are a few examples. Number 1, The Man in the High Castle. The Man in the High Castle, written by Philip K. Dick, is one of the first alternate history books to look at a Axis victory. Written in 1962 and set in a fictional 1962, it is where the Axis, they divide the world between themselves. For those who cannot be bothered to read, which is fair enough, I will dictate it to you. The red means the Greater German Reich. The dark red refers to the occupied countries. The orange is the Italian Empire. The pink represents the United States of America. The dark green is the Empire of Japan. The lime green represents the Great Eastern Asian prosperity sphere. The light green is specific states of America. The divergence from our time happens in 1934 when President Roosevelt is shot. Without him, the US fails to get out of the Great Depression and mobilise on war. Thus, the Nazis is able to defeat the UK and the Soviet Union, and Japan is left for the United States, and Japan ultimately defeats them. The world is divided into two blocks in a Cold War type situation. The former United States is divided between the Nazis and the Japanese Empire like this. Bizarrely, it seems that Canada is been able to avoid the whole war, the whole situation, despite being a part of the British Empire and been in active war with Germany since the start. It is also worthwhile mentioning that the Mediterranean Sea has been drained, which was actually like a proposed plan that was proposed by a German architect in 1920. Our second example is Fatherland. Fatherland, written by Robert Harris, is a slightly more realistic view of what Europe would have looked like after Hitler won the war. Written in 1992, it is set in a fictional 1964 in a week leading up to Hitler's 75th birthday. Unlike the man in the high castle, Japan was defeated by the United States, but the United States and the UK and Germany remain in a Cold War type situation. Germany has also gained control over all of Europe. Most of Europe has been divided into Nazi control, with Western Europe forming a European colony, although once dominated by Germany. Although I don't want to spoil the book for you if you haven't read it, one of the most major plot points revolves around what happens to Europe's Jews during and after the war. Number 3, In the Presence of Mine Enemies. In the Presence of Mine Enemies is one of the most recent books of the bunch, or the most recent book. It was written in 2003 and is set in a fictional 2010, where the US stay out of the Second World War, thus the Axis powers were able to win. The US subsequently lost the Third World War when the Axis powers used nuclear weapons. In this 2010, Germany and Japan are the major world powers, having conquered large parts of the world. Germany controls almost all of Europe except for Italy, Spain and Portugal, and having been victorious in the war, they control all of North America. Italy, Spain, Portugal and Germany and a white-led union of South Africans have split the control of Africa. Imperial Japan, on the other hand, control all of East Asia, including Australia and Alaska. If you're curious about what the 21st century might look like if the Nazis won, you might want to give this one a read. While Nazi Germany winning the Second World War makes for great literacy fiction, how plausible was it really? Here are a few facts to consider before making your own judgment. Now before I start, get ready to see numbers. Lots and lots of numbers. Number 1 is geography. Nazi Germany was 633 kilometers squared in 1939, in contrast to the British Empire in 1939 was 33.7 million kilometers squared. The United States was roughly 8 million kilometers squared, and the Soviet Union would grow to be 22.4 million kilometers squared in 1945. Even at its maximum height in 1942, Nazi Germany would only be 3.6 million kilometers squared. The German military relied on the Blitz tactic, which became increasingly difficult as distance increased. Plus, every new area they conquered required occupation. Therefore, without knockout victories, Germany became increasingly more weak as it grew. Number 2 is population. In 1939, Nazi Germany had a population of roughly 70 million people, more than either Britain, France, but far less than the Soviet Union. Even with the occupation of France and large sections of the USSR, in 1938 it established that Nazi Germany's GDP was, in fact, $375.6 billion. However, in that same year, the British Empire's economy was estimated to be $918.7 billion. At the height of the war, all three Axis countries, including which is Germany, Italy, and Japan, had a combined GDP of $911 billion. Still smaller than that of the US alone, which had $1,000 billion. To compound matters, Hitler was afraid of unrest at home, so he did not put Germany on a total war production wage until 1944, but the war was kind of lost anyway. The Allies, especially the Soviet Union, put more money into their military, which gave them the bigger edge. Number 4 is oil production. Finally, a modern military requires oil and lots of it. Nazi Germany was always woefully undersupplied compared to the Allies. By 1941, Germany was able to produce something like 9.5 million barrels of crude oil per year and produce an additional 31 million barrels per year of synthetic fuel products. The British controlled the Middle East, which was not the oil-producing powerhouse it is today, but it was still important in the 1930s and 40s. Finally, but most importantly, you have the United States. In 1941, they would have been producing 2/3 of the world's oil, producing roughly around about 4.5 million barrels per day. That means that 10 days worth of American oil production was more than what Germany could produce in a year. While greater Allied oil production did not lead to the victory of the war alone, Germany's resources always meant that it was in a precarious situation. In conclusion, we could never tell what would happen if Nazi Germany won the Second World War, but it's always interesting to theorise. Thanks for watching.